It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining us today, the Conservative peer and Times columnist Danny Finkelstein, Labour MP Nadia Whittome, The Guardian columnist Raphael Behr and The Spectator's economics editor Kate Andrews. Today, the wagons circle around Boris Johnson.
The Prime Minister is an ebullient, bouncy, optimistic, Tiggerish character.
Boris Johnson will be hoping for support from the benches behind him at today's Prime Minister's Questions, live at noon. Also today, calls inside and outside Parliament to scrap the Health and Social Care Bill.
Really, this bill should be called the NHS Corporate Takeover Bill.
Decisions should be based on what patients need, not what shareholders need.
We'll discuss the other migrant crisis on the Belarus-Poland border.
Почему я должен их задерживать на границе, когда они идут в Великобританию, в Германию?
And should we be accountable for anything we've ever posted online?
I'm not going to ask questions about tweets that I posted 12 years ago.
Let's start today's programme with the issue of babies in Parliament, in specifically the Commons Chamber and Westminster Hall. Let's show you pictures of the Labour MP Stella Creasy yesterday contributing to a debate with her baby there, as you can see, during that whole conversation. It was about consumer protections, particularly around Black Friday coming up. After she appeared, she was told and informed that it was actually against recently published rules to bring her baby into the Commons Chamber or Westminster Hall. She tweeted this: apparently Parliament has written a rule which means I can't take my well-behaved 3-month-old sleeping baby when I speak in the chamber. Still no rule on wearing masks, by the way. Mothers in the mother of all Parliament are not to be seen or heard, it seems. So my question to you, it's not the first time, by the way, either she or other MPs have brought babies into the chamber, but should MPs be allowed to bring their babies into the chamber? Raphael.
Well, if MPs could take parental leave, maternity or paternity leave, then it would probably be less of an issue. Since they can't, and there are reasons why they can't. It's complicated in terms of who's actually representing the constituents if the MP's on leave. It seems to me quite a reasonable concession to make. I mean, also, I have to admit, it's one of these issues or problems where if it had affected men over the last 20, 30, 100 years, I suspect it would have been resolved quite a long time ago. It seems to me to fall into one of those categories where, as it's been an inconvenience for mothers and pregnant women and women with young babies, it's only now that it's actually being pressed, which is a bit of a shame. But yes, it doesn't seem to be a problem to me.
Do you agree with that, Danny?
Yeah, I do. You don't need to have a rule. You can use common sense. Lots of workplaces use common sense, and I can't see why you need to have a rule. It was obvious from watching that video that it didn't cause anybody any problems. This is the main argument is you can't do this if you work in Tesco, or you can't. But then you can have parental leave in those places, and you can't do that in the Commons. So that Raphael made, I think, what was the key point. So it isn't too much to expect some judgment to be made. I'm sure Stella Creasy has enough judgment to know when her baby can be taken into parliamentary events and when it would be difficult, because all parents have an instinct for when their child, it would be more difficult to take them into places than others. And I think you can rely on a combination, the person chairing the session and the Member of Parliament, to make a common sense judgment without needing a rule. Well,
it won't surprise you to know that this is, I think, the second most read story on the BBC website. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, is going to make a statement in the House of Commons at around 11:30 in 10 minutes' time to address this issue about the rules, and we will bring any news of that to you, of course, as it happens. Kate, Danny mentions this idea of other workplaces being used to compare what happens in Parliament. I mean, is the Commons, is the UK Parliament behind other parliaments? And what about corporate life, bringing babies into board meetings?
Well, look, in terms of what Parliament can do to offer female MPs the opportunity to take maternity leave without having to jump over more hurdles, it seems like there's a lot more that can be done. And if Stella's goal is to highlight the fact that as still harder to be a working mom than it is to be a working dad for the countless cultural reasons we know. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. But I think in terms of being the image for this inequality, she might not be doing herself or the cause the greatest favour. Whilst there are more hurdles to jump over, other female MPs, countless female MPs, have had babies, taken time off. It is possible to do it. She had a locum MP stand in for her in 2019. There is a crash in Parliament, which I believe her son is just about old enough to join now. And we need to remember that there are countless women out there who don't have any options. Stella actually has a lot of options compared to your average woman. So I would just highlight that to say I don't think that this is so simple as to say it's not black and white. I think we over-legislate a lot of the time. I'm not sure we need specific rules for this, but I also don't think that she herself is necessarily the exact image that you want when it comes to inequality in the workplace.
Nadia?
I hope that this rule will be rescinded. I think it's disgraceful. I agree entirely with Raphael and Daniel on this. And I'd add that we need to be looking at making all workplaces more accessible. I mean, obviously, you couldn't bring a baby on a building site because that wouldn't be safe. But there's no reason why everyone, broadly speaking, shouldn't be able to take their child into work if they need to. And it highlights, I think, how inaccessible Parliament is. If we want Parliament to be more representative of the country, then it needs to be much easier for people to engage with it, like women, parents, people of colour, disabled people, the list goes on.
Let's talk about
Go
on, Raphael. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Just
go
very
for it.
quickly, Kate's point there that Stella Creasy, it might, because of the privileges and opportunities she has, isn't the best spokesperson for this is slightly paradoxical, because by definition she is able to get into that position to make this point on behalf of the people who couldn't get into that position precisely because they don't have those privileges. So if you wait for someone who's, in quotes, a better advocate for this position, you'd be waiting for a long time. So let Stella do it.
To be really blunt, I think it's slightly disingenuous for her to suggest that she doesn't have any other options. There are locum MPs that would be able to take her spot for a little bit so she could be on maternity leave. She doesn't have to do that. There's no pressure on her to do that. But to suggest that she has no choice, I think is quite disingenuous and is going to grate the wrong way with women out there, countless women out there, who really do have no choice when it comes to distinguishing between taking care of their children and going to work.
All right, we're going to hear what the Speaker will say at 11:30, and as I say, bring anything he does say to you. We're going to move on to the Health and Social Care Bill. It has been front and centre, a big, important piece of legislation going through Parliament. The government saw a significant rebellion earlier on in the week over changes it is proposing and has made to the way the cap on social care will be calculated. The government did win that vote, but there is quite serious unease on the back benches. The bill will now be heard in the Lords. Some Labour MPs, including our guest Nadia Whittome, have taken issue with another element of the bill, which they say opens the door to greater private sector involvement in the NHS. Nadia, this is your tweet. The Tories voted against creating the NHS 22 times. Today, they're pushing through a bill that would further privatise it, lining their pals' pockets at the expense of patients and health workers. In Parliament and on the streets, we will keep defending our NHS. Tell us why you're so concerned.
There are three big problems with this bill. The first and the biggest problem is that it does nothing to solve the crisis in the NHS and social care, nothing for the 6 million people on waiting lists, nothing for people who are having to wait almost an hour for an ambulance after a suspected heart attack or stroke.
And the issue particularly on the privatising.
The vacancies. In social care, it's even worse, and I know that firsthand as a former care worker, and that's something that we don't discuss enough. The second is that it allows the Secretary of State greater powers to intervene and is essentially a ministerial power grab. And the third is that it allows for greater privatisation of the NHS through integrated care systems. There are 42 of these, and private bodies will be allowed to sit on those, as has already happened with Serco in Bath and Somerset, and make decisions that are subject to less scrutiny. And that's a problem when we look at the last year or the last 18 months and the way that private contracts have been handed out to the likes of Randox and Serco for less scrutiny, to even less scrutiny to be on those, is disgraceful.
All right, let's talk to Dave West, who is the Deputy Editor at the Health Service Journal. Welcome to you. Dave, you will have heard what Nadia has said and obviously be aware of the campaign. Is she and others right to be concerned?
Good morning. On Nadia's third point, no, I think she's not right to be concerned. I don't think there's anything to be concerned about in relation to privatisation in relation to this bill. This bill, if anything, as some other Labour MPs who have been following this closely and know a lot about the health service have made the point, this bill, if anything, brings an end to contestability and the internal market in the NHS. So it is not, by any stretch, encouraging privatisation.
Right, in some ways?
Oh, apologies for the interruption. In some ways, because of competitive tendering, but that also means, and I have issues with that as well, but it does mean that contracts will be able to go straight to companies without a competitive tendering process. I think that the biggest problem here is that we're talking about restructuring, which costs money at a time that the NHS has been underfunded for a decade, and there is a huge crisis.
I understand that concern, but we want to investigate the claims, because obviously there is a disagreement here between what you are setting out and what Dave is saying in terms of concerns about creeping privatisation or more tendering to private sector companies. Dave, will you respond to what Nadia said?
Well, under the existing law, the Health and Social Care Act, brought in by the coalition government in 2012, there are quite substantial, the most requirements there's ever been on the NHS to tender services out to with potential bidders in the private sector. This will bring an end to that. There will, in extreme circumstances, still put some contracts out, but there's going to be much less encouragement of the NHS.
That doesn't get to the issue of the ICSs, though. So there are sort of two separate issues.
ICSs are NHS organisations, just like the NHS Integrated Care Board.
And what is an ICS?
Created
what is an ICS?
Some things about this bill are very complicated, and that's one. But the fairly straightforward aspect is that they are not a private sector organisation, and not something that's likely to encourage more private sector use in the NHS. They are a complex partnership of across health and local government, but to all intents and purposes, the bill is creating NHS organisations, NHS integrated care boards, which will take on NHS responsibilities.
I didn't say that they were a private organisation, but private bodies will be allowed to sit on them. That's a fact. The Conservatives put forward an Amendment 25, but it was full of loopholes, didn't go far enough.
Well, at the minute, there's more restriction than there is at the minute, which is... which is at the minute people can be selected to sit on clinical commissioning group boards if they wish to.
But the difference with this legislation
the one thing
is that it would make those ICS...
Hang on, the two of you, because if you talk over each other, including me talking over the top, then no one can hear anything. There is still one point you haven't addressed that Dave has raised, and that actually he says it will restrict further that private sector involvement or private bodies actually being represented. What do you say to that? I mean, that is the direct opposite of what you're saying.
Well, these ICSs private bodies will be able to sit on them, and the difference that this bill makes is that it makes those bodies statutory, so that they have statutory powers.
But do you accept that if Dave is saying they're actually going to be restricted, there's going to be less of it?
I don't accept that. But I also don't want to get bogged down in a discussion about privatisation when, yes, that is important, and I reject privatisation of the NHS.
The privatisation debate is a distraction from the other points you made, which
this is part of a wider conversation about the privatisation
I know, but actually your tweet very clearly here, Nadia, does state that it's...
It's also about the other two issues that I've spoken about, which is the crisis in the NHS and a ministerial power grab, and the fact that this bill does nothing to address those.
All right, let me hang on, Nadia, because I've got to bring the others in, and I know you want to talk about it in the whole, but we want to concentrate on this particular issue because I think it's difficult, as this conversation is demonstrating, for people to actually understand exactly what is going on. Dave, finally, although stay with us for the rest of the discussion, it's not just Nadia and some of her Labour colleagues who share these concerns. Health bodies, charities, doctors are joining the campaign, as we showed there in the headlines. Do you accept it's not just Labour MPs who have concerns about this bill? Well,
a lot of people have got a lot of concerns, but when it comes to privatisation, I think it's only fringe groups or people who are frankly non-expert or seeking to score political points who are talking about privatisation. There is an issue here about, in the NHS, aside from the bill, there is a big issue about private care now, which is that the NHS can't keep up with doing the number of operations that are needed. Therefore, more people who can afford it or have insurance are going to be choosing to go private and having to pay, and that is clearly discriminatory and likely to exacerbate inequalities against those who can't pay for it. So that's a problem that Nadia alludes to about needing to increase resources in the NHS. It's nothing to do with the Health and Care Bill, which is doing the opposite. All
right, let me bring the others in. Raphael, first of all, is it a fair criticism put forward by Nadia, using her tweet again, pushing through a bill that would further privatise the NHS? Because it is a topic, it's a hot topic, it's a topic of concern to a great many people.
Well, those are two different things, aren't they? I mean, it's not legislation that would enable the government to sell bits of the NHS infrastructure to private providers. That's simply not what the bill does. I mean, the Labour have said that the Tories will privatise the NHS in every campaign and every election pretty much of my adult life. And most of those campaigns Labour have lost, and the NHS has still not been privatised. And in the circumstances that there were a Labour government, that government would have to decide to what extent private provision is going to be part of the NHS offer. Of course it's going to be part of it, because the NHS doesn't have the state-alone capacity to do it all. Now, it's possible that sitting in these new structures, which are sort of a reinvention of the old strategic health authorities in some respects and not an entirely new thing, there might be some private sector representation there. And it is possible also that then becomes a conduit down the line somewhere where there's more private sector influence. And you can have a concern about that and argue about that. But that is just not privatising the NHS. It's allowing more private sector influence in the NHS potentially. And I think Labour, it's a mistake for Labour to just say this is privatising the NHS if they want to attack the Tories. Attack the Tories for their competence in running the NHS, not privatising it, because they're not privatising it.
Do you accept that important distinction?
I think I've said what I need to say on this, that this is part of a wider conversation about private sector involvement in the NHS. And the point is that when private bodies are allowed to make funding decisions, private bodies exist to protect and maximise profit, not to protect the interests of patients and staff.
Right.
And that's a problem.
But what Raphael is saying is this distinction between privatising the NHS, in other words, changing the model completely. It wouldn't be free at the point of use. It wouldn't be accessible without paying for healthcare, and some private provision within the NHS for the reasons that he set out. Is it important to make that distinction clear when you are putting out the sort of campaign material that you and some Labour MPs are?
The whole front bench has been united on this point. Let's be clear about that. This isn't just some Labour MPs and it isn't just some fringe organisations. And that's because we've all read the legislation. We all voted on it last night. And it's clear what this bill does, but that's also part of the government's wider sort of attitude towards the NHS and how it should be provided.
The Tory party doesn't want to privatise the NHS, and it really doesn't.
Some of your colleagues disagree.
It just really doesn't. And it's a tragedy in some ways, because I can listening to you, it's obvious you've got lots of experience that I certainly could learn from that you have that I don't have, and lots of interesting things to say. And then you say you don't want to get bogged down in privatisation, but you do want to get bogged down in it. And it's obvious from the things that you say. And it's also obvious that argument is not sustainable, because no independent experts, including the King's Fund, for example, thinks that this bill involves privatising the National Health Service.
Well,
it simply doesn't.
That's not the case. We've heard from organisations that do.
It is
but
that we haven't.
Why on earth are we not talking about the fact that we're set for the worst winter in the history of the NHS, according to many staff members? People are waiting an hour, almost an hour, for an ambulance to arrive when they've had a suspected heart attack or a stroke. 6 million people are on NHS waiting lists. There are vacancies of almost 100,000. In social care, it's even worse. Care workers are underpaid, overworked,
all those points,
and absolutely nothing is being done about it.
Sorry, Nadia, I understood all those points, and those were the points I responded to by saying they're very valid, important points for us to discuss.
So
but you're getting it just because you made this point about privatisation, and we're discussing that. And that is the point I'm making to you. You divert every conversation about the NHS, which we need to have, into a pointless discussion about a privatisation that's not happening. We don't discuss any of the fundamental issues as a result, and you have to think about the tactics you're using. You can't say you don't want to be bogged down on privatisation when we're on a television programme discussing precisely that because you raised it.
Right, but Danny, you have said the Tories don't want to privatise the NHS. Kate, there are some Conservatives, and not just Conservatives, who do want to talk about private funding or private provision or some sort of social insurance because they say the NHS is no longer affordable or sustainable in the current model for the long term. So you can understand people's fear.
Well, they're very few and far between these days. I mean, very few Tories are coming forward and talking about that. I think this whole debate highlights what a difficult position the Labour Party is in. Boris Johnson has pretty successfully pivoted the Tories to becoming the party of the NHS. This health and social care bill, as the King's Fund says, moves away from competition into what it calls collaboration. They are centralising healthcare. He has broken a manifesto pledge not to raise taxes, to raise money for the NHS. And the fact that Labour is having to default to its classic argument that we're privatising the NHS when it's quite clear every independent body, almost every independent body, suggests we're not, just shows how difficult they're finding it now that the Tories are on their turf. And it's really sad because the patients are losing out. A wonderful health and social care package would be one where money does follow the patient. We are not going to get through this waiting list, 5.6 million people and counting, without using private provisions, which, by the way, is not privatising healthcare. That's what most countries in mainland Europe do. It's what Australia does, New Zealand does. If you look at every developed country apart from the United States, they have universal access to healthcare, but they don't have the NHS. We could be talking about a really innovative system to deal with the COVID backlog, and yet we are bogged down in this privatisation argument, but I don't think Labour has anywhere else to go because the Tories aren't really challenging them on this idea that the NHS should be completely centralised, and it's the patients that are losing out because we're not talking about how we're actually going to get care directly to them.
Nadia?
I've literally raised two other big problems, which I said were the main problems with this bill, and we're not discussing them. I've said 3 times, why aren't we talking about social care? 8 billion has been cut from social care since 2010, and the people who suffer that are my former colleagues, are the people I used to care for, and
where would you find
instead,
the money for it? So, if you want to increase funding of social care, where would you find the money for it? Would you increase this new national insurance levy to say 3%, 4%, 5%?
I've already said no to the national insurance levy.
So where's the money coming from?
If you let me answer, that is a levy that hits working people, the lowest paid people, hardest because it's a flat rate of tax. It's also a problem because only 1 in 6 pounds actually goes to social care. It's not ring-fenced.
I completely agree. But where's the money coming from?
I believe that it should be that we should have a national care service because there's a universal need that should be met with a universal service, and that should be funded through progressive taxation, including a wealth tax.
Dave, I'm going to say goodbye to you at this point, but thank you very much for joining us. Final word, Raphael, on the sort of politics in terms of the next election and what Labour should be fighting on when it comes to the NHS.
Well, look, I think I agree with a lot of what was said there about how Boris Johnson has tried to position the Conservatives on this issue, and he understands very clearly that he really doesn't want to have to fight the general election on the question of can you trust the Tories with the NHS, and Labour would quite like that to be a main theme of the election. As I've said, I think it was a mistake to frame it around privatisation because, as we just heard, that discussion becomes a kind of a cul-de-sac pretty quickly. Ultimately, the big issue that will decide it will be a sense of competence, and that is a weak spot for the Prime Minister. And so I think, big picture, do most people think Labour loves the NHS more than the Tories? Yes, I think they do. Do a lot of people still think Tories can't necessarily be trusted with the NHS, despite Boris Johnson's pivot to a sort of a more pseudo-social democratic angle on this? I think that is the case. And so, look, if you have a really bad winter, really bad flu season, the fiscal situation doesn't get much better and the economy doesn't do something extraordinary, there will be vulnerabilities there for the Tories that Labour can exploit, but they have to exploit them intelligently on issues of competence and capability, not structural questions and privatisation.
All right, let me just show everybody this headline, Reuters headline. EU vows unity on Belarus as Poland flags more border incidents. Ursula von der Leyen yesterday, the Commission President, telling the European Parliament that the EU stands with Poland, Latvia and Lithuania in the standoff over the migrants' crisis with Belarus. You can see here thousands of of men, women and children gathering on the western border of Belarus, seeking to enter the EU. Pretty freezing temperatures there. There have been allegations that the Belarusian authorities have been helping migrants cross the border into Poland. The BBC's Steve Rosenberg sat down with the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. Here's a bit of that interview.
В этом кризисе миграционном виноваты вы, что вы создали этот кризис, вы используете мигрантов как политическое оружие. Вот как вам такая оценка?
В данной ситуации через Беларусь тысячи. Почему я должен их задерживать на границе, когда они идут в Великобританию, в Германию? Извините меня, создавать тут некий отстойник или лагеря для этих беженцев.
Pretty strident interview there with Alexander Lukashenko. Danny, we've talked a lot on this programme. It is now a pretty salient issue in terms of the channel crossings and the migrants coming across from Calais to Dover. Does this demonstrate that actually perhaps either we've been looking at this from the wrong angle, if you like, or that this is a global issue?
I urge anyone to watch this extraordinary interview. It was really amazing to watch Lukashenko's behaviour, his body language. That obviously wasn't true what he said. He is deliberately encouraged this crisis. He is effectively using poor refugees as a battering ram in his war against the West. He's doing that with the support of Vladimir Putin. It's a very serious challenge to the European Union, but to our common interests with the European Union as well. Having said that, it's extremely difficult, helpful to know exactly what we should do about it because the crisis is so serious. But clearly we need Western unity in order to ensure that Lukashenko understands that he will not be allowed to bully the West into reducing sanctions on him and to try to drive this dictator out of power to accept the results of his own elections by this sort of behaviour. So it's very serious.
It is, but has the UK government focused too much on the issue of migrants crossing the Channel when we look at the pictures, listen to that interview, and actually we should be working more closely on a much greater scale?
As it happens, I think that the country has to be serious about its own borders and about illegal immigration, so I wouldn't agree with that. But I do think we haven't paid enough attention to the threat now posed by this collection of autocratic dictators that Vladimir Putin and to some extent the Chinese are financing and assisting. And if we're going to let the bad guys win if we don't focus.
Right. What do you think, Raphael? Too much focus on what's been going on between Calais and Dover and sort of Anglo-French relations?
Oh, I think inevitably, the Channel is going to be of more interest to people in the UK politically. I mean, the Kent coast matters more than the Belarus-Polish border for a lot of people. I mean, there's sort of geopolitics.
Except in a way it feeds, doesn't it, the very crisis that then ends up on the Calais-Dover borders?
Absolutely, but I would just add something, in that context, very important to what Danny just said. Look, this is. You have these autocratic regimes. You have Lukashenko, who's now essentially a pawn of Vladimir Putin. It's a rogue state. It's essentially the sort of shriveled successor state to the Soviet Union in some respects, even more than Russia is. And what they have understood and what Lukashenko and Putin have understood is that the European Union is extremely vulnerable because it is a soft power. It is almost exclusively a soft power because where its strength comes from is the single market. It's a regulatory superpower. Has economic heft, but it doesn't have any tank divisions. And for a long time, that really wasn't a problem for the EU. Really from the end of the Cold War to just the last few years, the EU has been allowed to project itself, see itself as a global player, as a power in that context, a bit like the US, a bit like China and India on that sort of scale, which is true in soft power terms. And then the whole geopolitical culture and climate has changed now. And you have people who are attacking the EU and the institutions and the solidarity of the European Union in this very aggressive way, as Danny said, using people as weapons. And that's a real problem for the European Union. That's an existential challenge to what the European Union is and what it does. And that's an issue for Britain, but Britain's left the EU. So it's not as much of an issue for Britain as it is for the rest of the EU.
We're going to talk about something completely different. Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, appeared before the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee in Parliament yesterday. She was taken to task and questioned by one of the members, the SNP MP John Nicholson, who talked about and questioned the suitability of the content of some historic tweets, starting with her views on the BBC. Let's have a listen.
You called the BBC, as I say, left-wing, hypocritical, patronising, more in keeping with the Soviet-style country. Did you ever visit a Soviet-style country and watch the broadcasting there?
Yeah.
And you think it's like the BBC's?
I'm not going to ask questions about tweets that I posted 12 years ago.
You called everyone who works at the Daily Mirror, presumably both women and men, bottom-feeding scum.
How many years ago was that?
That was 2013. There's a continuity, I think. I mean, unless you're saying that everything you've ever written, everything that you've ever said previously has to be discounted because there's a statute of limitations.
OK, well, colourful exchange there between John Nicholson and Nadine Dorries. On that issue, Nadia, that you said at the end, John Nicholson, should there be a statute of limitations on politicians' tweets?
Firstly, just listening to that, my grandfather was a prisoner of war in the Soviet Union. This is no joking matter. I think it depends what you said and when you said it. But Nadine Dorries was an MP when she said these things. She was a woman in her 50s. 10 years ago, I was a 15-year-old child. I think that's a bit different. And it depends what you said as well. And I think people need to take responsibility for things that they've said and apologise and own up to it. And Nadine Dorries hasn't done that.
Kate, what do you think? Do you agree with Nadia that, you know, she was a grown woman, she knew what she was saying, already in a position of some influence, that should there be a statute of limitation?
No, I agree that context matters, and I think that depending on the crime, statute of limitation is not necessarily the right way to go. But I am really inclined to push against the cancel culture narrative, that things that you said as an adult or as a child or in between many, many years ago should necessarily discount everything that you do now. I mean, the funniest part of this story to me is that it was then revealed that John Nicholson had sent out a tweet about Nadine that was actually not very flattering to her. And I think, you know, most people out there are going to have said or done something that they regret. I agree context matters, and you can get into certain points of hypocrisy, but I think the hypocrisy really comes down to how you treat others when they make mistakes. I mean, you say we should be able to apologize and move on. We can't apologize and move on these days. If you apologize, they go for you more. They attack you more. They want to take everything from you once you've admitted guilt. We should be able to apologize for stupid stuff we said when we were kids, when we were young adults, even as an MP. But almost if you do, I understand why she didn't want to answer the questions, because she was only going to give those who want to cancel her more to run on. This is a horrible way for us to be conducting ourselves in society. It does not help debate. It does not mean that we can communicate. It certainly doesn't mean we can compromise. And who out there genuinely hasn't made a mistake?
Raphael?
I think there's an important distinction here, though, again, between something you have to apologise for. Let's say, you know, someone tweeted something offensive when they were younger, or even something racist, something obnoxious in many ways, which could merit an apology or not. And then, as you know, as Kate just said, you know, then the apology just becomes a reason for people to attack you more. And a separate question to a politician, which is, do you still believe today the thing that you said you believed in 2013? That seems to be a totally reasonable question to ask, and it should be perfectly reasonable to say, actually, I don't. I no longer believe that, and then explain why, or actually I do still believe that, and here's why. And that's really the question that Nadine Dorries was being asked. Do you still think that's true?
And does she didn't want to answer that.
I think she should be allowed to answer that question.
Do you think it was the question she was being asked? I completely agree with you. If you had a political position, say on the BBC, and then you change it, voters should know that. People should know that. I didn't get the impression that in the questions that she was being asked that was actually the goal. I got the impression that they were trying to tear her down.
I'm not a psychologist, I can't tell what he did think, but he clearly was wanting to know whether Nadine Dorries still thought those things, and she does still think them. Right? That's the truth, why she didn't want to answer the question.
Maybe that's the problem that Nadia...
She might, or might not, by the way, put them more diplomatically, but you know, both her political views and the way she puts them are the reasons why she's Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, because Boris Johnson kind of wanted to hand it to the people he thinks were holding the other end of the argument, right, on those issues, because he doesn't like the BBC much himself. So it was pretty pertinent, and I think you know, my view is with all these things, it's like with the question we asked earlier, it's a question of judgment and a sense of proportion. You've got to make a judgment about what the person was like when they made it, what it means. You know, it was like that with the cricketer being Jewish, trying to make an assessment about what he meant, what he thought about it now. You've got each of these things is an individual case. In this case, I think it was a perfectly reasonable thing to ask her. And the reason she didn't want to ask it is because she didn't want to admit now that it's undiplomatic that she kind of would express herself exactly the same way on the same issues now, and indeed has become a big political figure because of that.
Of course, it's perfectly reasonable for the Select Committee to ask the Culture Secretary, or should that be the Culture War Secretary now, what her views are on our national broadcaster. I think that there are 2 points here. One is the hypocrisy that Nadine Dorries says herself, that we need to conduct ourselves with more kindness online, and then has a hobby of attacking random Twitter users. And the other one, I think, is one of things being a learning moment. And I think that's something that should be encouraged. But in the case of Nadine Dorries, I suspect, as Daniel has confirmed, that those very much are her views, and we've seen that.
Raphael?
Well, look, I mean, there was an interesting case, similarly, not that long ago, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the International Trade Secretary, relatively recently had tweeted to the effect that she didn't really believe climate change was a thing, and that people who thought the world was getting hotter were a bit potty. And the Prime Minister was asked, essentially because he'd actually written articles in that vein as well, whether that was still the view. And he gave the obvious answer, which is no, I no longer believe that. People can change their minds. And actually that went away as an issue because that happened. And it is, there is then a separate issue here, which is whether the way social media works and the way Twitter works in particular has a coarsening effect that makes even the basic response, as in I've changed my mind or oh I'm sorry, and I think this is the point that Kate was making where she's right, is that you sort of pollute the whole climate of discourse where it just becomes possible to discuss it in the terms that we're saying it ought to be discussed, and that's a separate issue to whether or not Nadine Dorries has views about the BBC that she'd rather not say on the BBC.
Nadine? Sorry, Nadine. Talking about Nadine, Kate.
I thought the biggest point of hypocrisy is the fact and I thought where it was quite telling, is whether or not these tweets that she sent in the past would add up with the online harms bill that the government wants to push forward. If you're going to start outlawing things that you yourself have done, that I think requires more of a response, which is why I agree it all goes back to context. But these days, I think we are just in a horrible state of affairs where to apologise or to even say I got something wrong is for many people simply not an option because they know it makes the situation worse. I do think it applies in this situation. I think it applies across the board. And I think it's really hurting the course of debate.
All right, we're going to have Prime Minister's questions in nearly 10 minutes' time. We'll bring that to you, of course, live and uninterrupted, as always. I just want to point you to the headline from Danny Finkelstein's column about Boris Johnson. He has had a pretty torrid few weeks, some of it of his own. Yeah, sorry, not Danny Finkelstein. You may have had a torrid few weeks too, but we'll leave that for outside the studio. It's absurd to imagine, Danny writes, Boris Johnson will change. This is in response to the last few weeks of accusations of chaos. Certainly the Prime Minister's speech to the CBI was a reflection of how he governs, says Danny, but that's the style to which his party signed up. What are you trying to get at exactly, Danny?
I just was trying to save us all some time. We're going to go through this whole thing of if only he changed his Downing Street advisors, if only he had some people with grey hairs, he needs a new parliamentary private secretary. He is who he is. He governs as he governs, right? There are aspects of that I really like. There are aspects of that I really don't like. Neither of those are going to change all that much. I have to live with that. Every Conservative who looks at him and thinks, I depend on his leadership, I wish to defend certain aspects of it, but some of it distresses me, has to live with the fact that the bit that distresses them isn't going to change. And this speech, I saw somebody asked him this questionnaire, are you okay? And it became famous. He was perfectly okay. That's who he is, right? This was not a sign of somebody who'd lost confidence or lost his way. This is him doing what he does. And I just wanted us to sort of have a common basis on which to make a future analysis.
Right, so it wasn't a mistake in that sense, Raphael. This was classic Boris Johnson.
No, and there's very good evidence to support that view, because actually he made pretty much exactly the same speech to a think tank conference only pretty much a few hours later, CPS, Thatcher Legacy Conference. He did exactly the same shtick, but he did it in his after-dinner repartee way, and he'd obviously had a cup of coffee or whatever it was, and it was basically classic Boris Johnson. It was exactly the same. It's just he misjudged the audience, or he wasn't quite, he didn't bring his A game to the CBI. But I don't think that certainly doesn't change who he is. I mean, it's interesting. There is an exact counterpart column, to the one that's a very good one that Danny wrote, that you could write about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, which is, you'd say, he's done a lot of structurally what's necessary, to try and get the Labour Party, competitive again, and people recognise that he's serious and that he understands what needs to be done to, to reach out to the electorate. But if only he could be a slightly better communicator, if only he could tell jokes better, if only he could be more charismatic, which is, all the stuff people said about Ed Miliband, and he can't, because that's not who he is. And I think Danny's underlying thesis is exactly right. There is this temptation that you always get for MPs to say, if I could just turn the Allen keys on the IKEA flat pack leader I've got and tighten him up into the Habitat leader that I wish I had, then everything would be better, and it can't be done. Right. I mean, do you think it has done lasting damage, Raphael, to Boris Johnson these last few weeks? Never bet against Boris Johnson bouncing back is rule number one. But also, I think there is a very subtle and qualitative difference, when you have someone who has a shtick and who is a bit clownish, between laughing with and laughing at. And it's possible, if there is an inflection point that we've had this week, it's that now people are kind of laughing at, and that diminishes him. And once you're a bit ridiculous, as opposed to just a figure, someone fun who people are laughing with, I think that does become very problematic in terms of authority and Right. Well, Kate, do you think that change has happened? They liked it once, but perhaps not anymore. No, I think his base, and I think even a lot of independent voters still like it, but it is an important distinction that Raphael makes between people laughing with you and laughing at you. And I think the past few weeks there has been more of the latter. But of course Boris Johnson's okay. The bigger question here is, why didn't he take showing up to the CBI more seriously? After 18 months of a pandemic in which businesses, played a huge part in getting us through this, so many of which have just been on the brink of complete closure, you would have thought that even if he wanted to talk about Peppa Pig, which is a very Boris Johnson comparison with the rest of it, if he wanted to go and make jokes and all the rest of it, you would have thought he would have still prepared. He would have still shown up there with a bit, not even seriousness, but a desire to impress them. And the disdain I felt was coming across, especially compared to Keir Starmer's speech, was so disappointing. And this is a Prime Minister who's raising corporation tax, he's raising NICs for employers as well as employees.
Yeah. He's never taken the business organisations very seriously, and I think that is probably his serious position. When I heard Raphael say that he didn't take his A game to the CBI, that was all part of being Boris Johnson. I included that in a list of it. That's one of the things. I agree with Kate. I think that's a political misjudgment. Yeah. Boris Johnson would reply, well, my political misjudgments have done better than you, Danny Finkelstein, right? And I think, politically, and you do have to look at that. I think it's overstating it to say, it's all over for Boris Johnson or that, because I think the economy is critical. I also think it does underestimate the demographic coalition he's built. So I think that's just overstating it. I think there are some questions in terms of governing, however, about it as a style. For all that I sometimes approve of the general thrust of, for example, levelling up, you can't say that the sort of slightly chaotic, windmillish stuff doesn't affect the efficacy of that policy. It certainly does. Right. What about the people round him? Because there have been other senior Conservatives saying, well, it's the team. He should have an inner cabinet. It's such a diversion, that whole thing. It's just like you get one person the person doesn't know to replace them with another, and then two people arguing with each other. It's important to have good advisors. He's got perfectly good advisors. It's not that he is his own advisor. That's the crucial thing about him. He writes his own speeches, as he did on that occasion. He ultimately makes the calls, as he did on the Owen Paterson. It's a complete diversion to say if you had a different set of advisors, the advice would be different, because the advice to Boris Johnson would still be being given by Boris Johnson to Boris Johnson. Right. I mean, Keir Starmer is sport for choice to some extent at Prime Minister's questions in terms of what he can throw at and level at Boris Johnson. So he's been given a lot of material by Boris Johnson. Is he taking the fight, Keir Starmer, firmly enough to the Tories?
I think Keir Starmer's doing a phenomenal job of holding Boris Johnson's feet to the fire with regards to corruption in particular, and he's calling it what it is, not sleaze, not cronyism, but corruption, and that's very important from the leader of the opposition. I think that a change now that we haven't seen previously, say, a month ago, is that even some of the Tory MPs think that Boris Johnson has gone too far, that he's almost said the quiet bit out loud and actually whipped his MPs to get his friend Owen Paterson off the hook.
Right. I mean, Raphael, do you think that today is where Boris Johnson will be looking very carefully behind him to see the reaction from Tory MPs?
Yes, absolutely right. He's got an 81-seat majority. So Keir Starmer, he has good days, he has off days. I think he's capable in many respects. He's slightly lacking, I think, on the performance side of things. But he is entirely dependent on enough Tory MPs going off Boris Johnson and essentially diminishing the Tory majority by rebellion to get traction and get purchase and into the government. So ultimately, it is for the Conservative Party to decide what happens to Boris Johnson a lot more than it is for Keir Starmer. I think that's just a fact of parliamentary arithmetic.
Right. Do you agree with Nadia that Keir Starmer's strategy is beginning to work?
I think, yeah, to the extent I understand the strategy, which is to sort of be serious and capable and just and represent honesty and seriousness and competence, and wait for the government to unravel. I think that it's a workable strategy, and I think where it could go wrong is that Boris Johnson is so much better at some of the other aspects of politics, some of the craftier side, some of the performance side of it, that you could reach a general election and actually, in the heat of a campaign, Boris Johnson will still out-campaign Keir Starmer. I think that's also, especially if some of the underlying concerns that people have about the reliability of the Labour Party as a legacy of the Corbyn leadership and before haven't really been dealt with. So, a lot can happen in the next 2 years.
All right, Nadia.
I think that Keir Starmer and the whole of the Labour Party is united and is successfully showing the Conservatives to be corrupt. But what we need to do now is put forward a vision to the country of what Labour will do differently. And I've always said that should be centred around a Green New Deal that tackles the climate and ecological emergency and also the crises of poverty and inequality at the same time.
We're almost at PMQs.
Keir Starmer's moving away from Jeremy Corbyn towards the centre. Insofar as he can do that, that'll help him. He hasn't done it enough. If he does it enough, he will pose a serious threat.
Johnson's moving to the Labour Party. It's hard to see how Labour should raise taxes higher than the Tories. So, to be honest, I still think Labour's in a difficult position.
We've got the lowest corporation tax in the whole of the G7.
Well, on that, let's go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions.
This morning I had meetings with... Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. Thank you. Thank you very much. Immediately following PMQs, I will attend the Welcome Home march-in to thank all those involved in pitting our evacuation from Kabul. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Chris Bryant. I too will be attending I too will be attending in a few minutes. Nicky's 7-year-old son had 37 seizures a day because of a brain disease he suffered from. He's had surgery now, but it's a struggle every day to get him to stay in school. Nicky, is supporting the acquired brain injury bill because she believes that the government needs to have a cross-departmental strategy for supporting those who've had an acquired brain injury, whether that's rugby players with concussion and dementia, it's women who've been beaten in the head by their partners, it's people who've had brain injuries due to children who've had suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning, soldiers who've been in explosions. I really hope that the government is going to back the acquired brain injury bill. But above all, we need a strategy to help the 1.4 million people in this country. Will he give us that?
Prime Minister. I want to thank the Right Honourable Member for raising this vital issue and for his commitment to this cause, his personal commitment. And I can assure him that we are studying his proposed bill and working to ensure that people do get the support for the acquired brain injuries that they have received. And what we can certainly pledge at this stage to do, and I hope this will be of some use to him and the many who care about this issue in the way that he does, and as I'm sure members do across the House, the Department of Health and Social Care will lead on the development of a cross-departmental government strategy on acquired brain injury and other neurological conditions. I'll be very happy to share details with him shortly.
Felicity Bucker.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. Speaker. In July of this year, my constituency, Kensington, suffered devastating flooding, with more than 2,000 homes flooded, a river running down Portobello Road, and a lot of residents having to move into temporary accommodation. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that Thames Water needs to come up with short and long-term solutions, and they need to make sufficient investment in infrastructure to prevent events like this happening again?
Yes. Prime Minister. My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise flooding, Mr. Speaker, and she's right about short and long-term solutions, and that's why I'm proud, amongst other things, to have helped instigate the Thames Tideway Tunnel, with the biggest super sewer in the history of this country, which will help to deal with what happens in London when the Basingstoke interceptors overflow, and to deal with flooding throughout the city.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the last election, the Prime Minister promised that nobody would have to sell their home to pay for care. That's another broken promise, isn't it?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Speaker. Because if he looked at what we are proposing, and if he supported what we are proposing, which is fixing something that Labour never fixed in all their years in office, Mr. Speaker, we are saying to the people of this country that we will disregard your home as part of your assets if you and your spouse are living in it. And number two, Mr. Speaker, you can have a deferred payment agreement if you move out of it and you're living in residential care. You can have a deferred payment agreement. But most important of all, Mr. Speaker, by putting the huge investment that we are making now in health and social care, and we are allowing for the first time the people of this country to insure themselves against the potentially catastrophic, the otherwise catastrophic costs of dementia or Alzheimer's, Mr. Speaker. And even if you're not one of those people who suffer from those afflictions, we are taking away the anxiety from millions of people up and down the land about their homes.
Keir Starmer.
I think the Prime Minister just described the broken system he said he was fixing. So it's certainly not a straight answer. Let's have another go. Let's have another go. He used to say, I see they turned up this week, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, he used to say that...
Sorry. I don't think I need any further. Yesterday we had a very good example of the house being at its best in that church, in that cathedral. Please, let's show some respect. I want to be able to hear not only the Prime Minister but the Leader of the Opposition. Shouting each other down doesn't do you or your constituents any good. We need to hear the questions, and I certainly need to hear the answers. And if anybody doesn't like it, please leave now. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it's not a complicated question, so let's have another go. He used to say that nobody would have to sell their home to pay for their care. It's in his manifesto right here. On the basis of that promise, he then put up tax on every working person in the country. So has he done what he promised and ensured that nobody will have to sell their home to pay for care? Yes or no? It's not complicated.
Prime Minister.
No, it's not complicated, Mr. Speaker, because what we're doing is disregarding your home as part of the assets that we calculate. So if you go down to £100,000, that's the beginning where we will ask you to contribute. But your home is not included in that, Mr. Speaker. And they have absolutely no plan. They've spent decades failing to address this. And only a few weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, they failed to vote for the £36 billion that will enable us to fix this and to help people up and down the country, not just to fix the social care problem, but to pay for people to live in their own homes, Mr. Speaker, and receive the care they need in their homes. That's what this One Nation Conservative government is doing. Why won't he support it?
Mr. Speaker, he's had two opportunities to stand by his manifesto commitment and he's not taken them. Well, it says he just has. So let's test this in the real world, Prime Minister. Under the Prime Minister's plans, a person with assets worth about £100,000, most of it tied up in their home, would have to pay £80,000. They'd lose almost everything. How on earth does the Prime Minister think that they can get their hands on that kind of money without selling their home?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to have a third go at trying to clear this up in the befuddled mind of the right honourable gentleman opposite, because it is important, and the fact is that the party opposite have totally failed to address it. They haven't had the guts to fix this in all their time in office. It's something left over. It's something left over from the Eardley government, and we are fixing it. And let me repeat for the third time, Mr. Speaker, since your home is disregarded. Number two, even if you have a second home in your residential care, Mr. Speaker, you have a deferred payments agreement if you want. And number three, Mr. Speaker, we are allowing you to insure yourself for the first time against the catastrophic consequence by capping it at 86,000, Mr. Speaker. And now he stood on a manifesto to put the cap where, Mr. Speaker? At £100,000, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
The question was very simple, and it's the question all of his backbenchers on. If you've got a house worth about £120,000, £140,000, how do you find £80,000+ without selling your home? It's common sense. Strip away the bluster, strip away the deflection, strip away the refusal to answer the question. There's a simple truth, and this is why the Prime Minister won't address it. People will still be forced to sell their homes to pay for care. That accounts... Why did they... Look at the vote the other day to see the answer to that question. They'll still be forced to sell their home. It's another broken promise. Just like he promised that he wouldn't put up tax. Just like he promised 40 new hospitals. Just like he promised a rail revolution in the north. Mr. Speaker, who knows if he'll make it to the next election? But if he does, how does he expect anyone to take him and his promises seriously?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yet again he raises the rail revolution in the north. And the 3 new high-speed lines, Mr. Speaker, 96 billion pounds. Nothing like it. Again, nothing like it, Mr. Speaker. Nothing like it for a century. And just for the advantage of what I didn't even know this. I was in a state of complete innocence about this last week, Mr. Speaker. But it turns out that the right honourable gentleman actually campaigned against HS2 altogether. Said it would be devastating and said it should be cancelled. I can tell you something, Mr. Speaker. HS2 runs through my constituency as well. And I took a decision, even though it's been very tough for my constituents, I took a decision that it was the right thing to do for the long-term interests of the whole country. How can they possibly trust that man?
Mr. Speaker, I think he's lost his place in his notes again. The only thing he's delivering is high taxes, high prices and low growth. I'm not sure the Prime Minister should be shouting about that. And it isn't just broken promises, it's also about fairness. Everyone needs protection against massive health and care costs. But under his plans, someone with assets worth about £100,000 will lose almost everything. Yet somebody with assets of about £1 million will keep almost everything. It's just like their 2017 manifesto all over again. Only this time, something has changed. He's picked the pockets of working people to protect the estates of the wealthiest. How could he possibly have managed to devise a working-class dementia tax?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've answered that question 3 times already. This does more for working people up and down the country than Labour ever did. than Labour ever did, because we're actually solving the problem that they failed to address. We're disregarding your housing asset altogether, Mr. Speaker, while you're in it. And he talks about jobs, he talks about working people. Well, let me just remind him. There's just one key statistic that people should bear in mind. It's now almost a month after furlough ended. He talks about the economy, Mr. Speaker. There are now more people in work than there were before the pandemic began. And that's because of the policies this government has pursued.
Keir Starmer. Mr. Speaker, there's no getting away from it. Working people are being asked to pay twice. During their working lives, they'll pay much more tax in national insurance, whilst those living off wealth are protected. And then when they retire, Mr. Speaker, they face having to sell their home when the wealthiest won't have to do so. It's a classic con game, a Covent Garden pickpocketing operation. The Prime Minister's the front man, distracting people with wild promises and panto speeches, whilst his Chancellor dips his hand in their pocket. But now the Prime Minister's routine is falling flat. His Chancellor is worried that people are getting wise. His backbenchers say it's embarrassing. Your words. Your words. And senior people in Downing Street tell the BBC it's just not working. Is everything okay, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister! Well, Mr. Speaker, I tell you what's not working. It's that line of attack. Because I just want to repeat. I want to repeat the crucial point, Mr. Speaker. We're delivering for the working people of this country. We're delivering for the people of this country, and we're fixing the problems that they thought could never be fixed. We're doing the things that they thought were impossible. And let me repeat: there are now more people in work in this country, jobs up, with their wages going up, Mr. Speaker, than there were before the pandemic began. And that is because of the policies that this government has followed. Whether it's on rolling out the vaccine, if you remember, that he opposed, whether it's on investment that he opposed. He did, Mr. Speaker. He didn't want to invest in the vaccine task force. I seem to remember. Or whether it is making the strategic investments that we have. If we listened to Captain Hindsight, Mr. Speaker, we would have no HS2 at all, because that was what he stood for. And if we listened to him, we would all still be in lockdown, Mr. Speaker.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that he will use the rest of the UK's presidency of COP to urge countries around the world to make good on the pledges that they made in Glasgow? And does he agree with me that decarbonisation can create millions of jobs across the UK and around the world?
Prime Minister.
I totally agree with my right honourable friend who's right about this and many other things. And that's why our transition to green jobs is supporting 440,000 new green high-wage, high-skilled jobs across the UK. And the breakthrough agenda that we had endorsed at COP26, I believe, will support between 20 and 30 million jobs across the world by 2030. And I think that's probably a gross underestimate.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure you will wish to join me and indeed the rest of the House in welcoming the moderator of the Church of Scotland to the gallery today, Lord Wallace, and to thank him for his sage words at his sermon this morning. Mr. Speaker, the past few weeks have shown this Tory government at its very worst. A Tory sleaze and corruption scandal on a scale not seen since the 1990s. Tory cuts and tax rises that will leave millions of people worse off. A litany of broken promises, from HS2 to carbon capture, social care, the triple lock on pensions. And who can possibly forget the £20 billion bridge to Ireland that evaporated into thin air? At the centre of all this is one man, a Prime Minister who is floundering in failure. So, can I ask the Prime Minister, with his party falling in the polls, his colleagues briefing against him, has he considered calling it a day before he's pushed out the door?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I think, what the people of this country want to hear is less talk about politics and politics, and they want to talk about what the government is doing for the people of Scotland. And what the Scottish government is doing for the people of Scotland, which isn't enough, Mr. Speaker. But what we will do, he talks about infrastructure investment, and I can tell him that if he will wait till I think till Friday or later this week, he's going to hear about what we're going to do with the Union Connectivity Review to ensure that the people of Scotland are served with the connections that they need, and which the Scottish Nationalist Party has totally failed to put in.
Ian Blackford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That certainly wasn't an answer to the question I asked, but we're used to that. And I didn't expect the Prime Minister to take responsibility because he never does. But this isn't just about the chaos in the Conservative Party. It's about the state of the United Kingdom under his failing leadership. Because whilst the Prime Minister spends his time hunting for chatty pigs and staving off a leadership challenge from the Treasury, in the real world, Mr. Speaker, people are suffering a Tory cost of living crisis. Brexit is hitting the economy hard, but the Prime Minister can't even give a coherent speech to business. The Prime Minister's officials have lost confidence in him. Tory MPs have lost confidence in him. The letters are going in, and the public have lost confidence in him. Why is he clinging on when quite clearly he simply isn't up to the job?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I might ask the right honourable gentleman what on earth he thinks he is doing, talking about party political issues when what the people of Scotland want to hear is what on earth the Scottish National Government is doing. They're falling in the polls, Mr. Speaker. Their cause, yes they are, their cause is falling in the polls, and considering their manifold failures on tax, on education, and all the things the people of Scotland really care about, I'm not surprised, and I can see some agreement on the benches opposite.
Jonathan Lord.
Mr. Speaker, I celebrate the recent successes of Woking College, my local sixth form college, and I welcome the recent government investment for a new teaching block, which will allow it to expand. Many colleges and students find BTECs to be a really valuable qualification and course, enabling progress into higher education and skilled employment. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we should protect student choice and keep BTECs as an option for students?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we will continue. I thank my honourable friend. We will continue to fund some BTECs where there's a clear need for them. But I must stress to him that we've got to close the gap between the things that people study and the needs of business and employers, and that's what T-levels are designed to do.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rarely agree with the Prime Minister, but last week, when he said that COP26 showed that we can end our reliance on fossil fuels, I did agree with him. But that begs the question as to why his government is pressing ahead, not just with the Cambo oil field, but with 39 other oil, gas and coal developments, which would amount to 3 times the UK's current annual climate emissions. Now, I don't want an answer about all the things he thinks he is doing on cars and cash and trees. I want him to tell the House if he will leave those fossil fuels in the ground, will he cancel those projects? And does he recognise that if he doesn't, he will need to ask for forgiveness, not just for losing his place in a speech, but for losing the future of our children?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are not only powering past coal, going to an end to fossil fuel reliance in our energy generation at all by 2024, which is an absolutely stunning thing ahead of countries around the world. I'm glad that she's praising me for that. The Cambo oil field, as she knows, is for study by an independent regulator. But what we have also done, and led the world in this, Mr. Speaker, is stopped the financing of overseas hydrocarbons. And that is a fantastic thing which the whole world followed.
Dr. Andrew Burris.
Mr. Speaker, net zero, levelling up and building back better can't happen unless we have a massive increase in the supply of critical tech minerals like silicon, copper and lithium, but Beijing controls most of them. Noting China's recent tech minerals leverage on Japan, does he agree with me that the success of our green industrial revolution hinges on advancing our indigenous Silicon Valley? And free of the EU, what fiscal incentives can he now provide to make it happen at pace?
Minister. I thank my honourable friend for that. And as he knows, there are some very, very interesting and potentially very lucrative sources of minerals such as lithium in this country, whose exploration, discovery and reuse we are encouraging. But secondly, on the tax point that he rightly raises, we're going to use free ports to ensure that we support them as hubs for the processing of those critical minerals here in the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2014, my constituent's 3-year-old son, Freddie Hussey, was killed by an unsafe trailer. Every year, 30% of people who do the B+E test fail it. And now the government is abolishing that test, unleashing thousands of untrained, untested, unsafe drivers onto our roads. Why is the government breaking its promise to grieving families to make towing and our roads safer?
Prime Minister. I thank her very much for raising this with me, and I'm very sorry to hear about the tragic circumstances of Freddie's death. And what we want to do is to free up B&E licensing time so that we get more people qualified as HGV drivers. But that cannot compromise road safety, as she rightly says. So we will review the legislation and its consequences at regular intervals.
Thank you, Speaker. On the 2nd to 5th of December, Lincoln will be hosting its world-famous Christmas market in the grounds of the historic Lincoln Castle. And it would be remiss of me not to invite my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and yourself, Speaker, and all other colleagues, even the opposition front bench, to come and enjoy the marvellous long weekend of festivities. However, what is less than marvellous for my constituents is the levelling down of Lincolnshire's highway maintenance grant by 25% on 2019 to 2020 levels. Can my right honourable friend use his influence to cause the Treasury and DFT to revisit this unfortunate decision? Restoring this grant back to 1920 levels is imperative to the safety of my constituents, whether in vehicles, cycling or walking, as I would hope my right honourable friend would agree.
Minister. Well, I thank you very much for his question. I'll do my utmost, as I'm sure all other. I think he's invited everybody. So I'm sure a lot of people are going to be going to Lincoln, I hope. But I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, would have listened very carefully to what he had to say. Hannah Baldwin.
Inexplicable, Mr. Speaker, is how former Vaccine Task Force Chair Kate Bingham described his government's decision to cancel its contract with Livingston-based vaccine developer Valneva, a company the Prime Minister has himself visited. She also noted how shoddily Valneva have been treated and how damaging his government's decision has been for UK life sciences, exports and for jobs in my Livingston constituency, where a state-of-the-art vaccine manufacturing plant now lies unfinished. There has been no apology to the incorrect statements in the House, so can the Prime Minister please meet with me and representatives from Valneva, and will he tell me whether his government has tabled any proposals to reach an amicable resolution which was promised at the dispatch box, and if not, when will he do so?
Minister. Yes, I thank her very much. I was personally very disappointed when we couldn't get approval for the Valneva vaccine in the way that we had hoped, and I know how disappointing that was to colleagues in Scotland. I will certainly make sure that she gets the relevant meeting. But what we are doing is investing massively in this country's vaccine capability across the country, so that we are prepared for the next pandemic. And I very much hope that Valneva will be part of that.
Nigel Mills.
Thank you. We know that serious side effects from the COVID vaccines are very rare, but for my constituent Sarah Kite that wasn't the case, and she suffered a very serious reaction, leaving her in constant pain and losing most of her eyesight, and she now can't work. The Prime Minister successfully and quite rightly speeded up all the vaccine processes except one, the vaccine damage payment system. Can we now get on with making those payments so people who have suffered these very, very serious reactions can get the financial support they need?
Prime Minister.
Yes. I thank him very much, and I just want to reassure him and indeed to reassure the House and the country that cases such as the very sad one that he raises are extremely, extremely rare, and we're putting more money in to gather evidence for claims such as the one that he describes. But I want to repeat perhaps the most important message I can get across again today, Mr. Speaker. I want to repeat how vital that vaccination programme is, how safe it is, and how important it is that everybody who is eligible gets their booster when they're called.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's integrated review concluded that the Chinese state poses a systemic challenge to our national security, and the Prime Minister has made clear that when it comes to China, we must remain vigilant about our critical national infrastructure. Can he therefore confirm today, unequivocally, that plans for China General Nuclear to own and operate its own plant in Bradwell in Essex have been abandoned, and explain to the House precisely how and when his government intends to remove CGN's interest from the Sizewell C nuclear project?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much for his question, a very important issue that he raises, and clearly one of the consequences of our approach on critical national infrastructure, the National Security and Investment Bill, is that we don't want to see undue influence by potentially adversarial countries in our critical national infrastructure, and so that's why we've taken the decisions that we have. And on Bradwell, there will be more information forthcoming. But what I don't want to do, Mr. Speaker, is pitchfork away wantonly all Chinese investment in this country, or minimise the importance of this country of having a trading relationship with China.
Daniel Kuczynski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be very pleased that Shrewsbury Conservatives are doing everything possible to help Neil Shastri Hurst, the excellent candidate in North Shropshire. But he will also know that the #1 issue affecting Salopians at the moment is the £312 million that we've secured for a modernisation of our A&E services. This has suffered terrible delays over the last 8 years, leading to a worsening of our A&E services for local patients. Will he do everything possible to help us get this finally across the line so that we can provide safe A&E services for all the people of Shropshire and Mid Wales?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and that's one of the reasons why we're investing £36 billion more in our NHS now to help cope with the backlog, the extra winter pressures, particularly on A&E. But it's also a reason why the booster programme is so vital, because we don't want those beds filled with COVID patients, and we don't want delayed discharges either.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So far, his government have found billions for nuclear, but nothing for the Scottish carbon capture cluster, nothing for pump storage hydro, and now are at risk of failing the tidal stream generation, a technology Scotland's a world leader in. Now, the ask is for a £71 million ring-fenced marine pot in next month's energy auction. So the Prime Minister's got a choice: provide this money and allow continued scale-up and commercial success based on a UK supply chain, or see the manufacturing jobs move abroad. What's it going to be?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm so glad he asked that question, because I can tell him, and I can tell his right honourable friend, the leader of the SNP in Westminster, that we will be including a support for tidal stream. For tidal stream in the upcoming to the value of £20 million. Come on. Not to be sneezed at. Not to be sneezed at, Mr. Speaker. In the upcoming Contract for Difference auction, I've met representatives of Scottish Tidal Power. I think it's fantastic, original, inventive what they're doing. We want to support it.
Sir David Evan.
Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, I've been out campaigning with our excellent candidate in Bexley, Sidcup, Louis French, for the by-election, and responses on the doorstep are very good. The opposition know nothing as usual. Can my right honourable friend confirm that he will continue to implement our 2019 manifesto and implement policies to ensure that we build up better for the whole country, including London, because this is what the electors in Bexley want.
Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can, and I have happy memories over many years of campaigning with my honourable friend in Bexley and Sidcup. And I can tell him that we are delivering on our agenda for the people of London, putting 20,000 more police out on the street and making sure that they get to outer London boroughs as well, and making sure that Londoners do not suffer from the crazed outer London tax that would see motorists penalised by the Labour mayor for driving into their own city.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cherwell Larder in Kidlington does incredible work serving nearly 2,000 of my most vulnerable constituents, but at the moment there simply isn't enough food to go around. And this is a national crisis. Stock for charities like Fair Share is down 30%, in part due to the same supply chain issues that are affecting supermarkets. So will the Prime Minister help the Cherwell Larder, firstly by restoring the funding to Fair Share, but also what more can he do to incentivise businesses to give away surplus food this winter so that no family need go hungry this Christmas?
Prime Minister. I want to thank her for raising Fair Share and what they're doing to support people this winter and indeed at all times. But I would also say that my experience of business is that they do an amazing job of contributing to this effort. Iceland is one of the companies that springs to mind. But on the supply chains, we're addressing it night and day, and we are seeing some of the problems starting to ease. They are the result, Mr. Speaker, of the British and the world economy coming back into life, which, quite frankly, would not have happened if we listened to the gentleman opposite. I just remind you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend, the Prime Minister, was bang on Monday when he spoke about ending the unfairness of our high energy-intensive industries paying more than they pay overseas. So we know he is a friend to steel in Scunthorpe. So will he continue to do all that he can to ensure that my world-class steelmakers are on a fair footing?
Prime Minister. Yeah, I thank my honourable friend and everything she does for steel and for Scunthorpe, and I can tell her that I do believe that British Steel has suffered as a result of decisions taken years and years ago from unfair energy costs. We need to fix it, and this government is getting on and making another of the long-term changes we're instituting, Mr. Speaker. We're putting in the nuclear baseload that this country has long been deprived of.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Prime Minister, in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be introducing a bill to ban the import of hunting trophies. Not only does that have widespread public support and support from opposition parties, but in the past the principle has been supported by Conservative manifestos, the Queen's Speech, and indeed by yourself. So, Prime Minister, on Friday the 10th of December, will you tell your whips not to block the bill, but to let it go forward so we can work together and end this vile trade as soon as possible?
The honourable gentleman is completely right, and that's why we're going to introduce legislation this Parliament to ban the import of hunting trophies and delivering the change that we promised, and I hope that he will support it.
Sir Mike Penning.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister cheered all of my constituents up when he came to South West Hertfordshire and said we were going to have a new hospital. Sadly, Prime Minister, even though the money's there, the local management of our trust have blocked it. They're going to refurbish Watford and not give us a brand new hospital on a greenfield site, which is what we want. Prime Minister, will you meet me and some of my constituents to unblock this and tell the NHS they need to build a new hospital for Hemel Hempstead?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to my friend. I do remember the issue being raised with me when I was with him. I'll be very happy to secure a meeting with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, and who I'm sure will be able to unblock things one way or the other.
John Nicholson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scots stood slack-jawed this week with astonishment at the news that the Prime Minister has abandoned his DUP bridge to Northern Ireland. Perhaps he'll offer hot air balloons for the crossing instead and inflate them himself. Broken bridge promises to Scotland, broken rail promises to Northern England. With buyer's remorse consuming the Tory backbenchers, who does he think will be defenestrated first? His hapless Tory leader in Scotland or himself?
All right. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to remind the Scottish Nationalist Party that they are there to represent the people of Scotland and to deliver better services, better transport, better healthcare, and what we are delivering. He talks about transport, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell him what I said to the leader of the SNP in Westminster. What we are delivering is the first thoroughgoing review of union connectivity, so that we look properly at all those roads, the A75, the A77, the A1, all those vital connections for the people of Scotland that have been neglected by the SNP, that this government is going to fix.
Final question, Miriam Kay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm absolutely delighted with the £500 million Start for Life funding that was announced in the budget. And my right honourable friend knows from personal experience how important those early years are, whether that's parenting advice, access to healthcare or age-appropriate theme parks. So does he agree that rolling out family hubs to 75 local authority areas is a great start? But can he confirm that if this is a successful programme, the government's aim is to roll it out across the whole country?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much, and she's totally right in what she says about Start for Life. And I'm just seeing if my right honourable friend is still in her place, which she's vanished. But I want to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Northampton, because she has championed this for many, many years. She is right. Mr. Speaker, investment in kids' early years is absolutely crucial. That's why this government has begun Start for Life. And yes, if it works, Mr. Speaker, we will roll it out across the country.
We're now going to come to the urgent questions for those who need to leave.
That brings us to the end of a pretty lively Prime Minister's questions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there was an awful lot to go on for Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition. Let me welcome my guests, our guests for this part of the programme. Alex Chalk for the Government, Solicitor General, welcome to you. Steve Reid, the Shadow Community Secretary for Labour, and the BBC's political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Nick, as I say, Keir Starmer pushing the bruise of the changes to the social care cap, sort of broadening it out to broken promises by the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. What did you make of the exchanges?
A bit calmer than last week, wasn't it? There wasn't the Speaker erupting in the same way. But the theme was broadly the same, wasn't it? Keir Starmer thinks he's onto something here. You can say, here's what the Prime Minister tells you will happen, and when you get the fine print, it's a bit different. And that issue of whether anyone will have to sell their home as part of the new social care plans is one that I think we're going to keep hearing, because there are some circumstances in which you would have to sell your home. That's why Boris Johnson didn't want to get into the detail of Keir Starmer's specific question. The government will keep selling this as a much better plan than the one that's in place at the moment, but they'll keep being reminded by Labour that it's not exactly what they promised back in 2019.
And that's true, isn't it, Alex? Because in the Conservative manifesto of 2019, nobody needing care should be forced to sell their home to pay for it. Now, this is an extremely thorny issue and important for so many voters. It isn't true to say that nobody will have to sell their home to pay for care.
Okay, so this is an issue which is quite technical. Here's a really, really important point. If somebody is getting domiciliary care, in other words, someone coming into their home to provide care, the value of that home that they are living in does not count towards their assets, point one. Point two, if they go into a residential care home and their spouse is still living there, the same situation applies. If they do go into domiciliary care and their spouse is out and they have a home there, then even then it would not have to be sold whilst they're alive, because you can have these deferred agreements. Now, I know that... Hang on. But when Labour go on this territory, I think we've got to step back, because he was talking about £120,000 homes and so on. If you think about my constituents, the average price for a home about £250,000, £260,000. At present, all of that, up to £23,000 could be gone. And the truth is, Labour have not got...
Well, that's different. We'll come on to that. No, but hang on, Alex. Let's stick with the very important issue and the claim that was made consistently by Boris Johnson that nobody will have to sell their home. Let me just show you this from the Health Foundation. This is a very, very clear graphic setting out what happens to those who are less well off or have fewer or less valuable assets than someone much better off. How much will I be left with under the government's new proposal? So if you look here, I will read it to you. Starting assets of £100,000, let's say around £100,000. You will be left with £20,000 if you have to pay up to £86,000 towards your care, broadly speaking. Now, that leaves you with hardly anything. Most people's assets, or many people's assets, are tied up in their home. How else will they pay for it? Other than having to sell their home. Starting assets, if you've got more, £270,000. Well, again, you're left with £184,000, a much bigger proportion of that £270,000. Starting assets of £500,000, again, you're left with almost all of it, £414,000, compared to losing practically everything if you have assets of around £100,000. Does the Prime Minister and do you need to be much clearer and more truthful when it comes to exactly what circumstances people may end up having to sell their most valuable asset to pay for their care?
Okay. Well, what is absolutely clear is wherever you are in the UK, whatever your level of income, however big your house, however small your house, everyone is better off under this system. And I think that is a critically important
But you are losing so much more of your assets if you are less well off.
Well, if you have smaller assets, then of course there are, there are factors there. But I think we've got to step. But I do think we have to step back for a moment. The average house price in this country, about £265,000. At the moment, you lose almost all of that if you are unfortunate enough, through no fault of your own, to develop dementia. Now, we as a country have got to have an answer to that. What this government is saying is that the maximum you will ever have to pay of that is £86,000. Insofar as anyone else has come up with any ideas, which they haven't, Labour said you should have to pay £100,000. So for the first time, people can insure against it in a way that they would never have to before. And that is an enormous step forward, and I think that shouldn't be lost.
Alex, you stood on a manifesto that said nobody needing care should be forced to sell their home. Do you accept that that isn't being fulfilled?
Here's the point. But that person who is sitting there thinking, am I going to have to sell this house right now for me to get care? The answer is no. They will not.
After they die.
But that is the current situation, isn't it?
But if they're having domiciliary care, which a lot of people want, people coming into their homes to provide that care, the value of that asset is not considered as part of their assets. That's fair and that's right. Nor indeed if their spouse is there.
Now, what about residential care? You're trying to get round with technical points that are made about this. People just want to know if they're going to be affected and have to sell their home if they go into residential care. When the Prime Minister says your home will be disregarded, is that true? No.
Well, the point is they're in a much, much better position.
But that's not the same. But that's not the same. Let's just be clear. You can't disregard your home, can you?
No,
you may be in a better situation. Many more people may be in a better situation. But is that true?
Well, if you're in residential care, you will not have to sell your home right then and there to get your care. Now, it is true, and this is, Jo, you're absolutely right, that, of course, if up to £86,000 needs to be spent, then it may be... Well, hang on, but it is important that it may be that you have deferred payments, but you will not be on the hook. If you're that person with £120,000, which he's referring to, you're on the hook for £100,000, as indeed the Labour Party said in its manifesto, you will have to pay up to £100,000. So they've got no answer to this. But what we are saying is £86,000 is the cap, and that is something which gives people certainty and fairness.
I will let you come back in just a moment, Nick. Steve, you will have heard Boris Johnson say in response to the questions on this from Keir Starmer that Labour and he haven't had the guts to grapple with this issue. And that is true. You may dislike the proposals or they may not satisfy you. The graph that we have shown does state very clearly that if you are less well off, you are going to lose proportionately more, but they have grappled with it.
But they've broken the election promise they were elected on. It was very clear in the Conservative manifesto, no one will have to sell their home to pay for care later on in life. And the proposals we've seen from the Prime Minister now mean that people will have to sell their home. He's unbelievably resurrected the dementia tax, only this time with a difference. It's a dementia tax on working people, and it's a dementia tax that targets the north. If you are a homeowner in the north of England, as a result of the changes that were announced last week, 2/3 of homeowners in the north of England will be worse off as a result of this. And the graphic we just saw, if you've got a home, if you're living somewhere like Lee, outside in Greater Manchester, where the average home is worth less than than £150,000, you lose nearly everything. But if you own £1 million home in Kensington and Chelsea, you lose almost nothing. How can that possibly be fair or equitable?
Can I just say, if you think about your constituents or my constituent, your constituents in Croydon, right? They could wake up tomorrow, develop dementia. They might have a house worth £260,000. They could be wiped out by that, and that is monstrously unfair.
No one should have to sell their home. That is the point.
You were elected. How can you say to your constituents, "Don't worry about that. We're just going to leave it, and we're just going to completely be relaxed about the fact that you're going to be wiped out"? That's a lottery, and it's a lottery on people's health, and it's unfair. Someone's got to address this. Someone's got to grip it.
You were elected on a manifesto that you're now tearing up, and it's not just a dementia tax. High-speed rail.
All right. Well, do you accept the 86,000 cap is better than the current situation?
Well, there are aspects of this that would be better, but there's fundamental.
OK, all right. Well, OK, but you do accept that it is fundamental. It is fundamental. Well, hang on. But you do accept that the £86,000 cap is better. The way it's calculated is going to be absolutely different. But
it's not fair for people that have to sell their home.
You admit
because if you've got a home worth £100,000 and you've got to find £86,000, where do you get it from other than from selling your home?
The thing is, you're talking about the extreme.
Many Conservatives, they don't have £100,000.
So you're talking about the Kensington and Chelsea mega mansions, and you're also talking about other. Think about the average, the broad mass in the UK.
Working people in the north?
No, not at all. If you think about working people in my constituency in Cheltenham, working people in your constituency in Croydon, they will be looking at this. Thank
your
goodness
government likes to talk about levelling the country.
All right,
you're ignoring all those targeting working people.
Before I come back to Alex, Nick, can you clear this up for people, for our viewers and for our guests? Will anybody have to sell their home in circumstances to pay for their care?
Yes, quite potentially. There are circumstances in which you can defer it until after you die, but there will be a point at which your assets have to be sold. And I think that's part of the nervousness in the Conservative Party, not just on this, but more widely.
There were spaces again today on the green benches.
Not as many as last week, but still a few spaces. It's that nervousness that Boris Johnson, with his boosterism, promises big, promises a lot, and when it comes to that detail of promising, it is quite difficult to deliver absolutely everything, even if, as both Steve and Alex have suggested, the system is better than the one that's in place right now.
Labour hasn't got a policy, though, has it?
I mean, you have to look at this.
Well, what is Labour's policy? Because I hear your vociferous complaint.
We need to put up taxes to fund social care. But what the government has done is they've targeted working people. National insurance contribution, a tax on jobs that they said they'd never introduce.
We've done that very.
People with assets are not paying anything more.
So what would Labour? Right, and how would you do that? How?
Well, we'd look at income people get from shares. If landlords are getting an income from renting out a portfolio of properties, we would look at that. But we wouldn't always go to working people time and again. And with this return of the dementia tax on working people, it's always the same people they're going for. Tax them more, take away their homes. It's not what you were elected to do.
Right, it is about trust, Alex. And we've, I think, established, haven't we, that what the Prime Minister has said, what he repeated in the House today, is not true when it comes to circumstances that some people will have to, at some point, sell their home, use the asset of their home to pay for their care. Do you think the Prime Minister needs to be clear about what he promises and then when he breaks that promise?
I think clarity is important. And by the way, there were things where there did have to be a change because of the pandemic in terms of NI. So that is true. All I would say on this is it is actually quite a detailed and technical policy. Because
trust is important, isn't it? And even Conservative MPs are obviously completely fed up.
No, I agree. But the only thing, and you're absolutely right to raise that point, the only thing I would say is this, is that a lot of people in my patch, in my constituency, they would be thinking in terms of selling their home, right, I'm going to have to lose my home now in order to pay for these residential care home fees. That is not what is going to happen. And the point is you can only get to that point if you introduce a policy. Because if you don't, you're on the hook. You are going to have to sell it. You're going to have to sell it now, and that is a much worse situation for people to be in.
Your colleagues in the north of England who were elected in 2019 are going to be happy with this. Do you think they were sent to Parliament to take away their pensioners' homes when they get dementia?
Look, nobody wants to run the Russian roulette of waking up with dementia.
Don't introduce this policy then.
Paid your taxes and played by the rules. Say again?
Presumably, you'll be going to vote for this.
Well, of course. Listen, if we do nothing, the manifest unfairness to your constituents...
But that isn't the criticism, isn't it? It's not about not...
is clear. And as I say, Labour just simply don't have an answer to this.
All right.
All that happens is we just go round this again. Because after all, Tony Blair was...
Well, we're not going round and round. We're trying to test the veracity of what the Prime Minister is saying. Are you happy with how the Prime Minister is leading the country in your party?
Yeah, look, I know that there was this issue about the speech the other day. On the fundamentals, what is going to make a difference to, frankly, whether people survive and thrive over the coming months? Those fundamentals are good. You know, on this business about the boost, I know people don't want to sort of talk about vaccines anymore. We are way ahead of other countries, which means more people will live through
All right,
winter.
let's talk about the broken promises. What I'm referring to is, hang on, what I'm referring to is the conflation of Owen Paterson and standards for MPs.
Yeah.
Broken promises when it comes to how the social care cap is calculated. Broken promises on HS2, which is not, again, what was promised in the manifesto. Are you happy and comfortable with the way the Prime Minister is governing?
I am happy on the fundamentals. £96 billion.
Are they not fundamentals?
No, these are absolutely. If you strip it back, right? Are we going to keep people healthy over the winter with their booster campaign? Yes. Are we going to give people jobs? Bearing in mind, 12 months ago, people thought we were going to have 12% unemployment, destroying people's lives. We've got jobs. Is the plan for jobs working? Are we going to have more doctors, more nurses? On those fundamentals, investing in infrastructure.
People are facing a cost of living crisis, and the Tories are living on another planet. They just don't recognise it. Inflation at its highest for 10 years. Wages today still lower than they were 14 years ago. People can't afford to pay to heat their homes this winter because gas prices have spiralled out of control. The highest level of personal taxation for 70 years. You're making people's lives a misery and then telling me they're grateful for it.
I'm going to take a break here and bring Nick Eardley back in, because you have been looking into and digging into the sort of new role that has been carved out for Michael Gove, both on levelling up and on planning. Close ally of the Prime Minister. What have you found? Well,
it's another area where the government could face quite a lot of tension with its backbenchers over the next few weeks and months. So two elements to this that are really important. One is planning. We know that Michael Gove shelved the plans that were so controversial with backbenchers. He's ripping up the carpets just now to try and figure out what else can be done. There's still a lot of nerves in the Conservative Party that there won't be enough of a change. But what is being discussed in government is the idea of basically ditching the planning bill that we have at the moment and trying to integrate this with other things, like make it part of levelling up by talking about regeneration. The question there is whether that's just a way of rebadging what was happening before, or whether there's going to be a fundamental change. The more immediate one, though, which is coming either at the end of this year or early next, is cladding. We know that there are dozens of Conservative MPs really worried about how the government dealt with the cladding issue, worried about the fact there are millions of people who can't sell their homes as a result of some of the rules that have been brought in since Grenfell. There's a bunch of Tory MPs who are organising on this, who want the government to set up its own insurance scheme, similar to the one you have for homes that are vulnerable to floods. They think there might be some movement from Michael Gove on that. There's these things called consolidated advice notes, which have happened to loads of people in smaller and medium-rise flats. They are on the way out. The question is when. And then there's also a question of whether people should pay VAT on fire checks, all areas where if Michael Gove doesn't give ground, he's facing a battle with his own party.
And we'll keep a watch on that, because I want to play you something the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Louise Haigh, said yesterday on GB News.
We're a unionist party in the Labour Party, but if there is a border poll, then we should remain neutral. I think that's an important principle. Look, I believe in the union. I believe we're stronger together. I believe in the principles and values that underpin our union. But it is a crucial element that has sustained peace, is the principle of consent.
What is Labour's policy on this, Steve?
It's just what you just heard it from Lou, and I thought she put it absolutely right. The Labour Party believes in the union of the United Kingdom. Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, brokered the Good Friday Agreement that ended the troubles in Northern Ireland by being an honest broker, not by taking sides. If it comes to the point there's a border poll in Northern Ireland, and currently the polling there implies most people wouldn't be in favour of that poll, but if it did come to that, the best role for the government of the United Kingdom at that time is to remain an honest broker, because otherwise you you risk triggering an outcome.
Except Keir Starmer in July said, I respect the principle that the decision in the end is for the people of the island of Ireland. I personally, as the leader of the Labour Party, believe in the United Kingdom strongly and would want to make the case for a United Kingdom strongly and will be doing that. So this is a complete change.
The Labour Party is a unionist party that would like to see the...
But she said we'll remain neutral.
If we're the government at that time, you have to be an honest broker. Just like Tony Blair did in the Good Friday Agreement, if they'd taken one side or the other, it would not have been possible to bring the two sides together. So Lou's absolutely right there. You have to be an honest broker. The situation in Northern Ireland is incredibly fragile. The Conservatives have just put a border down the Irish Sea that means it's no longer easy to trade between Great Britain, the mainland, and Northern Ireland. It's really inflamed tensions. Yeah. You have to be very, very careful that we do nothing to reignite the troubles that we've not had for 20 plus years.
You have been clear, but a lot of people were taken by surprise at what Louise Haigh said. So just to clarify for our viewers, Labour in government, in the event of a poll, a border poll, you would remain, as a Labour government, neutral in that.
If you want to be an honest broker, that is the thing
you would
to
be
do.
neutral. You wouldn't, as Keir Starmer say, want to make the case for a United Kingdom strongly.
The Labour Party is a strongly pro-union party, but in that circumstance, the best thing to do is be an honest broker so you don't trigger a result you don't want.
Alex?
You can't call yourself a strongly pro-unionist party and then say we're not going to advocate for the union. I mean, I genuinely find that an extraordinary position. And I think yesterday we saw the mask slipping because the Labour Party has always been a bit ambivalent about the union. And now we've got all the proof that we need. When you're talking about the integrity of your country and you're being asked, will you stand up for the territorial integrity of your country? And Labour is saying, no, we're just going to leave the field. This is our country.
Down the Irish Sea.
Our country. And you're saying we don't have a view. We don't have a view.
You've done this.
What have they done?
They've put a border down the Irish Sea. They negotiated a botched Brexit deal that's put a border down the Irish Sea, so you now can't ship goods from one part of the UK to another.
Nick, I mean, this is a departure, isn't it?
They did this.
It is, and it's a really difficult issue for the Labour Party because they've struggled to come up with a consistent position on Scotland as well. And in the imminent period when you're going to have another election in Scotland, potentially in a couple of years, that could be quite damaging for your unionist
That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests today, and I will be back, of course, with Politics Live at 12:15. Bye-bye.